let's be courageous. Call it out. What's your biggest fear?
Failure.
So, this is going to sound weird, but my biggest fear is my own suicide. Wait a minute. Back up there, Nicole. Yes, you heard right. I'm afraid of my own suicide. I imagine what you're thinking. You're saying, what? How? Suicide is my choice, right? Many people would say that, and I understand their arguments. And I disagree. There are a lot of myths out there about suicide. Throughout today's sermon, I will be pointing out myths, risk factors, and warning signs of suicide. But just like diet and exercise can lead to a lower risk of heart disease and many other illnesses, there are protective factors against suicide as well. First, suicide is not a simple matter of choice. There's nothing simple at all about suicide. Only a few of the many factors involved are biochemistry, genetics, stress, and environmental factors. Note, I did not say selfishness, a disregard for human life, or weakness. If suicide can be said to have a cause, it is important to note that 90% of people who die by suicide have a mental illness at the time of their death, usually depression. Now, this morning at the AFSP forum, Heather Conray made a point, and I want to make that point too. Just because you have mental illness does not mean that you're going to die by suicide. It's not 100%. In fact, more and more scientists are concluding that mental illness is a brain disorder, just as Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. Suicide risk number 1. Mental disorders, particularly depression and other mood disorders. The good news is that depression is one of the most treatable mental illnesses. 80 to 90% of people who suffer from depression respond positively to treatment. So why is depression so scary if it's so treatable? It may be cliche to say, but depression puts you in a very dark place. One reason people fear the dark is because you can't see, right? Many people can't see why they're depressed. Unfortunately, mental illness is equal opportunity. It doesn't matter how successful you are or how many good things you have going for you. Depression cuts across economic, social, and racial classes with equal disregard. Quite often, there are no logical or environmental circumstances to blame. But what if you don't know anybody with mental illness? Actually, mental illness is very common. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, it affects 1 in 5 adults. They state, you probably do know someone with mental illness and don't realize it, because many people with mental health problems are highly active and productive members of the community. Let me say that again. Many people with mental health problems are highly active and productive members of the community. What? There goes that myth that anybody with mental illness is just a drain on societal resources. Okay. But what about those people with mental health issues that are violent? Again, quoting the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the vast majority of people with mental illness are no more violent than anyone else. In fact, People with mental illness are 10 times more likely to be victims of violent crime than the general population. The problem with all these myths about mental illness is that you have two fights. Not only do you fight the illness, but you fight the stigma of mental illness. This makes it harder to reach out for treatment, even when the signs of mental illness are recognized. My mom recognized the signs of depression when I was in the 2nd grade, but I did not receive treatment until I was placed into foster care at the age of 14. My mom was convinced that I would grow out of the depression, and it would go away once I had a spouse or children, something outside of myself to focus on. If only it were that easy. Protective factor number 1 against suicide: being involved in a cause larger than yourself, such as children or a spouse, or let's say the Out of the Darkness walk. You knew I had to throw that in, right? A quick aside, if you want help registering for the walk, today's the last day, see me afterwards. Also, Heather Conroy from the AFSP was awesome. She left a ton of material, amazing stuff to look at. And I also made a sheet of local resources available for mental health. That said, no, depression is not just being self-centered, as my mother was implying. Eventually, my therapist bluntly told my parents that if they didn't take my depression seriously, one day they would wake up with me dead. My parents loved me dearly, and they heeded that warning. I returned home at the age of 17 and was stable for many years. But at 24 years old, I sank into such a depressive episode that it was my employer who urged me to take short-term disability and seek intensive treatment again. I did, and this time I was absolutely determined to resolve all those trauma issues and get rid of my depression once and for all. Yeah, I was so naive. After several unsuccessful attempts at finding a new therapist, it was ultimately working closely with my doctor and changing my medication that pulled me out of that depressive episode. Even though my doctor cautioned me to limit myself to working no more than 30 hours a week for the foreseeable future, I felt stronger than ever. I was so optimistic that I wanted to consider weaning off my medication. My doctor kindly informed me that with my history, I would probably need to be on at least a maintenance dosage of medication for the rest of my life. We'll just say that I was a little less than enthused at this idea. He asserted that he had seen this before, when someone is doing well and thinks they can go off meds, and they would in fact do well for a while. And then something out of the blue, say a car accident, would trigger a depressive episode worse than before. I was more than a little annoyed when he turned out to be right. I couldn't keep the medicine down during the difficult pregnancy with my daughter, and I had never bothered to get back on the medication. And then came 2010. Within the space of a year, I lost my beloved 23-year-old cat and had not one, but 2 car accidents. This time, it wasn't a spiral into depression so much as a free fall. At first, I was reluctant to go back to my doctor even after the years of successful treatment with him. In part, this was due to not wanting to acknowledge that he had been right about the whole car accident thing. But also, I wanted to be stronger than the depression. I wanted to tell myself that I could recover from it out of willpower alone. I wanted to believe that all the knowledge and skills I had learned to cope with my depression were enough. I felt like a failure because I hadn't somehow prevented it from coming back. I was afraid I would lose my job or be considered an unfit parent. I was afraid of being judged by my friends and family. Yeah, ignoring the need to go back to the doctor didn't work out so well. I became unable to focus in my job and did only that work which was absolutely necessary. If the task could be put off, it was. And I spent most of my working hours journaling my depression in my private blog, posting on an online support forum, and playing Bejeweled on Facebook. My depression became so intense that there were days and even weeks at a time that I would not be able to get out of bed except to go to work. And that's not for lack of coffee. At home, I became increasingly overwhelmed with parenting my 2 special needs children and was often too depressed to function any more than meeting their basic needs. I would sit at the computer all day, unable to muster the energy to do chores. Even the thought of mustering energy for sex and doing the work of maintaining our marriage was exhausting. Nonetheless, my husband was very supportive and gave me as much space as possible to do whatever I needed to do to get through. But there wasn't much I could do. I was unable to tolerate the lights, sounds, and cacophony of options in the grocery store, or even go outside in bright sunlight. Only on the most unavoidable of social obligations was I able to muster the perfect mask that nothing was wrong. I could be here all day talking about the many friends and family that helped us through this time, but I want to spend a little bit of time focusing on the community resources that are available to you as well. Raise your hand if you've heard of 281-CARE. Yes! It's a hotline operated by the Talbert House that is the local contact for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. For 2 years, I would call every Friday at 2 o'clock when I got off work as a sort of second therapy session to help me get through the week. Online, there are several free crisis chats, and the people at chronicsuicidesupport.com, that forum, the people there have understood me when it felt like no one else could. I also leaned on my local friends for support. Protective factor against suicide number 2, close connections with friends or family members. One friend, who for the sake of confidentiality we'll call Wilhelmina, became my daily go-to person. I greatly respect her, and she urged me to go back to the doctor. But having lost insurance with my husband's recent job loss, I couldn't afford the $75 self-pay to go back to the doctor I had been seeing for so many years. Risk factor number 2, lack of access to behavioral health care. Wilhelmina gave me the number to the UC Mental Health Clinic, which serves anyone with Medicaid or Medicare in Hamilton County. Although it seemed forever to get in to make an appointment, I was assigned a therapist in January 2011, and I still work with him today. Normally, this would be the happily ever after part, but let's keep it real. It's not that easy. 3 months into counseling, it became clear that something in my life had to give. How do you face those hard choices to figure out what to do when the right option is often the hardest? How do you gain the courage to do the right thing? Depending on which source you look at, either George Eliot or more often Nicholas Butler is attributed in saying that necessity does the work of courage. It was my inability to perform my job duties that was hitting me the hardest. Out of necessity to focus on my health, I quit my job and applied for Social Security disability. Getting approved for disability is a lengthy process, and meanwhile, my mental health was still deteriorating. Although I liked my therapist, I didn't really have faith that he had the skills to help me. Nonetheless, I was still trying to hang in there and still hoping he could help. I remember one Friday that was particularly difficult. I called my therapist and told him that I honestly had no idea how I was going to get through the weekend. We discussed a number of options that I agreed to try, and he asked if I thought any of them would work. I thought for a moment and said, no, not really. He paused and said, then you're screwed. Okay, I can't really say what he actually said from the pulpit, but it did get the point across. You don't choose to have an illness, but there does have to be a choice to fight it. He can fight with me, but he can't fight the depression for me. And so I fought, but not alone. My friend Charmaine lives in Canada. Unbeknownst to me at the time, her education in working with people who have developmental disabilities included training in suicide intervention. One night, as I stood on a purple people bridge above the flooded Ohio River, I sent her a message describing my feelings, trying to decide what I could possibly do to make the unbearable pain stop. She replied, Nicole, you are in too much pain to make this decision right now. That is the wisest advice I've ever heard, and I took it to heart. She also introduced me to the excellent song that Spencer Elliott played this earlier. And if you didn't get a chance earlier, I recommend that you look at those lyrics on the back of your insert. They spoke to me deeply, and I clung to them when I wanted to go on, but I didn't feel like I had the strength to do so. By early June of 2011, I was hopeless that anything would ever make me feel better. The amount of guilt and self-loathing for my lack of ability to function was intolerable. My depression told me that I was a horrible worker, friend, wife, and most importantly, mother. Warning signs for suicide numbers 1, 2, and 3. Feelings of hopelessness, guilt, and worthlessness. I had a therapist. I was receiving cognitive behavioral therapy and concurrently participating in a dialectical behavior therapy group. I even tried eye movement desensitization reprocessing, or EMDR for short. All of these treatments are proven to be successful in treating depression and trauma. I was desperate to find relief from my constant distress, but nothing seemed to be working, and suicide increasingly seemed to be the only way out of my emotional agony. Session of EMDR that broke me. The first session had brought me such a sense of peace that had been missing from my life for so long that it was almost euphoric. And it left me with very high expectations for the next appointment. But the second session was so intense that I became overwhelmed and mentally shut down. The doctor misinterpreted my shutdown as a positive reaction to the session. My last hopes had been pinned on those treatments working. The seeming failure of EMDR and the contradiction of the doctor's reaction led me to despair. I left that appointment, drove to Bass Pro Shop, and bought a gun and accompanying ammunition. Warning sign of suicide number 4, seeking access to the means to commit suicide. When I returned home from the Bass Pro Shop, I discovered a letter stating that my disability claim had been denied. For a month, I spent an increasing amount of time learning about how to use the gun and going through the motions of killing myself. I was also writing in my private blog, the one place that I was openly able to express my feelings. Warning sign number 5, talking or writing about death or suicide. I should have been leaning on my therapist for emotional support, but in reality, I was leaning far too heavily on my friend Wilhelmina. Depending on her to keep me stable led her to think that she was my only support, and that my life depended on her ability to get me through each day. The stress was so much that her children were able to tell what kind of day I was having by their mother's mood. I was unaware of that fact at the time. Not knowing what else to do, Wilhelmina sent an email to my therapist. She told him what I could not, and shared my all too detailed blog posts. Within hours, the mental health crisis team came to my house to assess the situation and took me to the hospital. Okay, let me just say that Wilhelmina still supports me to this day. In fact, she is here. Can we give her a round of applause? I love you, lady. I was at the hospital for 2 weeks, and everyone was very relieved when I lost my Second Amendment right to own a gun. In the hospital, I finally resumed medication. It was a step in the right direction, but not enough. The medication made an obvious difference, but it didn't miraculously take away my problems or my depression. I was still filled with self-loathing and hopelessness. A year later, I made a suicide attempt that resulted in a stay in the ICU, another long stay in the psych unit, and the blessing, a much more effective medicine regime. And that, finally, was the turning point. Not so coincidentally, it's also when I started coming here to St. John's. Protective factor against suicide number 3, active involvement in a church or spiritual community. The 7 principles are radically different from what I grew up with, but I needed to hear them. At first, I sat right over there against the wall, speaking to no one any more than was politely necessary. I would sit there long after the service was over, and I'll never forget the kindness of those people that answered the call to love and asked if I was okay. And yet, even with all the things here that I desperately needed, I was still afraid to join St. John's. So I set up a meeting with Mitra, and I asked her if she thought that I would be ostracized or if people would be afraid of me if they found out I had a mental illness. She's an honest kind of person. And she said, you know, this isn't utopia. There may be some people that would have a problem, but most would be okay. So, as the welcoming reading this morning said, I took a little risk with these good people. I signed the book in 2013. And after 2 years of appeals, my disability claim got approved in 2013 as well. Overall, I consider that a pretty good year. And then, last year, I got up here at the pulpit and told you all that I had depression and have attempted suicide. Would you believe that not one person threw holy water at me and ran away? I appreciate that. Okay, I didn't really think that I'd get holy water thrown at me, but I was afraid of judgment and scorn. To paraphrase the words of another friend, courage is doing it afraid. Thankfully, my fears of shunning have not been realized, and I am truly grateful for that, because I really kind of like it here. There is no such beauty as where you belong, and I belong here at St. John's. Believe it or not, there are blessings in every challenge, although sometimes you have to work real hard to find them. I certainly don't recommend learning them this way, but being suicidal can sure put things into perspective. When that loaded gun is in your hands, you're not thinking about the report you haven't finished at work. No, you're thinking about the fact that your husband and children are going to be home at any minute, and you don't want them to be the ones to find you. When you're faced with an illness you can't ignore, you learn what's a myth and what's the truth. When it's too dark to see out, you have to look inward. You may not like what you find, but you may find the road home to yourself, to the light within you. The responsive reading said, we may learn how to cope. May we learn how to cope, like those who live one day of pain at a time. When you're suicidal, it's not a day at a time. A day, an hour, is an eternity. It's 1 minute, 1 moment at a time. It's breathing in peace and breathing out love. It's swimming even when it hurts, even when memories like bullets fire at me from a gun. Suicide remains my greatest fear, but we all do it afraid. Whether it be the child that gets on the bus for the first day of kindergarten, the young person that goes on their first date, or the leap to a new career, we all find the courage to wake up in the morning, hopefully with fresh coffee. So think back to your greatest fear. What do you need to gain the courage to face it? What blessings can be found in the struggle? And who can you lean on when you need a friend? Speaking of me, let's stand as you